He made it his home, his retreat, his sanctuary. The Obersalzberg was an ordinary Bavarian mountain until Adolf Hitler discovered it in 1923. Up on top, 700 kilometers from Berlin, the Nazi leader spent a quarter of his reign surrounded by his most faithful lieutenants and his mistress, Eva Braun. At the center of the ultra-secure compound stood his immense house, the Berghof. And above that, perched on a rocky peak at 1,800 meters, the famous Eagle's Nest dominated the region, symbolizing their thirst for grandeur. Here, overlooking a breathtakingly beautiful landscape, were conceived the darkest ideas of humanity. But on the site, despite the bombings and the will to make the past disappear, there are some remnants.
This is in the right place to be this.
Through field studies, survivor stories, and computer-generated imagery, we will discover how a quiet little mountain was transformed into a gigantic military political complex. 70 years after the end of the war, what are the Obersalzberg's trees hiding? What remains of the network of tunnels and the sprawling bunker system dug inside the mountain? How does history live on in every corner of Adolf Hitler's Alpine refuge? Bavaria, Germany, in the early 1920s. In a country decimated by war and in economic collapse, a new extreme right-wing party, the NSDAP, is growing in Munich. The National Socialist German Workers' Party, symbolized by a black swastika on a red and white background. It's commonly referred to as the Nazi Party. Its leader is about 30 years old, his name Adolf Hitler. Anti-Semitic and anti-communist, this great orator and former German army corporal is skilled at using simple language and persuasive arguments. He claims to want to restore the country's greatness and crisscrosses Bavaria, building his propaganda machine. In the spring of 1923, he goes to Berchtesgaden, a small village in southern Bavaria, for the first time. It is a small, quiet mountain community. The young Adolf comes to meet the anti-Semitic writer Dietrich Eckart, one of his most fervent supporters, who will also become his friend. He registers in the Moritz guest house under the pseudonym Mr. Wolf. This pretty inn, highly regarded by Bavarian nobility, is located on a small mountain which climbs to 1,000 meters, the Obersalzberg. In front of it stands the Untersberg, a large massif that runs along the border between Austria and Germany.
It all began on the morning of April 29th, 1923, when Hitler woke up and looked out that window and, as he said, fell in love with the landscape there, and in particular the Untersberg.
This 1923 spring morning will forever change the destiny of the Obersalzberg, for it was here that Adolf Hitler returned to stay a year later, before which he was imprisoned for 9 months for attempting to take power in Bavaria by force. In his cell, he began to write his book, Mein Kampf, and decided when he was free to go back to nature on the Obersalzberg to complete his work. During his stay in prison, Dietrich Eckart died from his alcohol and morphine excesses. Hitler finished the second volume of his book, dedicating it to his author friend, who had given him his ferocious hatred of the Jewish people.
And I want also to reckon among them that man, who has one of the best, by words and by thoughts, and finally by deeds, dedicated his life to the awakening of our nation, Dietrich Eckart.
Dietrich Eckart is one of the most underestimated individuals in Hitler's life. He really shaped Hitler as a person. He was absolutely vital in Hitler's early political career. This may be part of Nazi mythology, but Eckart was alleged to have said on his deathbed, Hitler will dance, but it is I who played the tune.
The first evidence the Nazi leader left in the Obersalzberg region dates back to the death of Dietrich Eckart. It can be found in the basement of the Berchtesgadener Anzeiger, the local newspaper, where the archives are kept.
The first notice of Dietrich Eckart's death on December 26th in Berchtesgaden is here in the Berchtesgaden Anzeiger from December 29th. The first notice was written by his friends, and a few pages after, there's a second death notice with the swastika. The swastika is backwards, perhaps because of the type at the printers. It's quite interesting to see that there is a death notice from his friends and a death notice from the party. It shows that there was already a political party at the time, which only grew from there.
Beginning in 1924, Adolf Hitler's steady rise gradually led to irreversible changes on the peaceful little Bavarian mountain. Jeff Walden is one of the foremost experts of the Obersalzberg. Passionate about the Second World War, this former American soldier spent years stationed in Germany. He has dedicated a great deal of time to his research. He has published several books on evidence of the Third Reich in the region. In recent years, Jeff has scoured the area to find remains from the period, so he knows every inch of the mountain. In order to carry out his investigation, he has used the original plans and thousands of archival photographs collected throughout Europe. So he knows precisely where the buildings occupied by the Nazis once stood and what remains of them today. On the mountainside, he found the remains of the Kampfhaus, the first chalet Adolf Hitler stayed at in the early 1920s.
When he was released from prison, he came back to the Obersalzberg he had visited before. He came back here to stay and use this quiet area as a writer's retreat. There were a few trees in the woods here, but not as many as there are now to block the view. There was a little wood cabin here that the stones are the remaining foundation of that cabin, and he used that as a writer's retreat to finish his book, Mein Kampf. During the Nazi times, this house was preserved as sort of a shrine to Hitler and his book, Mein Kampf. And the visitors who came to the Obersalzberg, this was one of the special sites that they came to visit.
In 1928, Hitler decided to rent the Haus Wachenfeld, a small house located a few hundred meters below the small chalet. This typically Bavarian building rented for 100 marks per month. Little by little, what was once a hideout opened its doors to the admirers who flocked to him.
You know, before 1933, this was Hitler's very private retreat. He interacted with locals. We know the story of Mitzi Reiter, a girlfriend that he had a serious love interest early on. A lot of local interactions. Clearly, in 1933, when he becomes chancellor, it becomes a place of pilgrimage, and this is where we see these crowds, you know, the hundreds, even thousands of people who come from all over Germany to walk by his house.
Hitler bought the Wachenfeld house with the income from Mein Kampf's colossal sales. Very quickly, overwhelmed by the idolatrous crowds and busy in his role as the Chancellor of the Reich, he decided to enlarge it and heighten its security. Between 1935 and 37, the construction work took place in three main phases. First, a botanical garden and a garage were added to the Wachenfeld house. In 1936, during the largest expansion phase, the small wooden house was swallowed up by a huge adjoining building. A deck was created above the garage. The last phase extended the left wing and created another one on the right side of the house. In 1937, the Wachenfeld house gave way to an enormous building, now called the Berghof. Its 30 rooms house Hitler's apartments, his photographer, his mistress Eva Braun, and all the staff. The centerpiece of the house was the central living room and panoramic bay window. Made up of 90 small windows, it was 7 meters long and 4 meters high. 28 square meters of glass, a real show of technical skill that offered Hitler's guests a breathtaking view of the Unterberg.
Hitler once said he designed the Berghof around a window. Hitler would bring political leaders there, would stand them before the window and essentially say, you know, this is my power, this is my realm.
Bombed at the end of the war by the English and then by the Americans, the buildings were entirely destroyed by the Bavarians themselves to prevent the Obersalzberg from turning into a Nazi pilgrimage site. So today, there is very little evidence of Adolf Hitler's famous Berghof.
The main thing that can be seen on the Berghof site today is the retaining wall that was behind the house. This was not part of the house, and the house was not attached to this wall. It was just a large concrete wall that was put here to hold the hillside from moving forward into the back of the house. Visitors would arrive in the driveway. They would come up the grand staircase. The SS Honor Guard would be lined up here, and then they would enter through one of these 3 archways into the Berghof proper. And it's thought that this piece of stone here is the base of one of these 2 pillars that form the main entrance to the Berghof. I have taken a tape measure here, and I've done a lot of measuring, and this is in the right place to be this. Right about up there. Hitler's bedroom was right up there. The famous terrace was on top of the garage itself, so it would have been right up there.
Just above the Berghof, the Zumtobel Hotel was transformed into a barracks for Hitler's bodyguards. Above that lived Martin Bormann, the one who oversaw everything. Bormann ran Hitler's property. Totally devoted to the Führer, he was the feared master of the Obersalzberg. Today, a luxury hotel stands where his house once was. However, the building's original plans are kept at Munich's Architecture Museum.
This old
Obersalzberg house was a children's sanitarium. What's interesting is that from the outside, it looks typically local, simply to keep the vacation home feel. But inside, we know that the house was furnished quite luxuriously. In the Munich archives, invoices prove that he possessed the most expensive collections of minerals, and that everything was very luxurious.
Martin Bormann knew that for Adolf Hitler to continue to come to his Berghof, his inner circle must accompany him, and his loyal followers must be near him to ponder the Reich's future. He had to either refurbish or build homes and barracks to house soldiers. Under Bormann's oversight, 60,000 workers were sent to the Obersalzberg, and the mountain became a gigantic construction site.
The
Obersalzberg illustrates the way Bormann put himself at the forefront. By appropriating this personal project of Hitler's, he seized his chance to exercise his power. He forced all the Obersalzberg's residents to give up their property. When he did not actually force them out, he threatened to do it. He ran a brutal construction site. Omnipresent, bad-tempered, the architects complained about a man who, without a clue of what he was doing, put an enormous amount of pressure on everyone.
Aber hat bestimmt und hat das Ganze unter Druck dann extrem diesen Ausbau vorangetrieben.
Part of Martin Bormann's success was that he always was 2 thoughts ahead of Hitler. He was always anticipating what Hitler may want or could need. And before Hitler even needed to ask the question, Martin Bormann had already delivered the answer.
In just a few years, the Obersalzberg changed its appearance and became the second Nazi decision-making center after Berlin. To ensure the safety of the Chancellor, access to the area was forbidden.
Eventually, the entire Obersalzberg was a Sperrgebiet, a closed area. Hitler was protected by 2 or 3 rings of security where he lived. There was an inner ring right around the Berghof area itself, and all of these rings were fenced off with fencing just like this here. This is part of the original fencing.
The secure area possessed by the Nazis covered 10 square kilometers. Guard posts were placed around the 3 security perimeters, and 35 new buildings were built. Among them was a house for Hermann Göring, Commander-in-Chief of the Luftwaffe, and another for Albert Speer, the Nazis' party chief architect, and even a theater.
Here we are in the ruins of a large theater hall, the so-called Theaterhalle. It was built in 1937 to provide a venue for entertainment for all the workers who were stationed here on the Obersalzberg. This was mainly a place where they could come and watch cinema films. All the workers were allowed to come in. The seats were free. This was the audience area. The projection room was at the front of the theater hall, and so the films would have been projected on a screen on the back wall. We're actually standing below the floor area, the main area of the theater hall. It was supported on these concrete pillars, so we're in what would have been the basement then.
Die Theaterhalle war etwa, wie wir hier auf dem Plan sehen können,
As we can see from the plans, the theater was 35 meters wide and probably 65 or 70 meters long. That's big, yes. The building was designed for 2,000 workers. Sometimes there were also propaganda events. Clearly, we can see the Reich Eagle everywhere. They used it to try to influence the workers.
On the mountain, it was highly important that Nazi dignitaries and their staff could live self-sufficiently. And to feed them, Martin Bormann had big plans. Beneath the secured area, he transformed a building into a huge farm called the Gutshof.
We're standing on what is now a golf course, but in the 1930s and 40s, it was just a meadow of the Gutshof farm. The main buildings we see in the valley with a silver tin roof, that's part of the Gutshof farm. It was built as an experimental farm or model farm. Martin Bormann was a farmer at heart, and farming continued to be one of his hobbies, so he had to have a farm here.
Die Geschichte ist
On the Obersalzberg, the farms were destroyed, the farmers were driven out, and everything was replaced by the Bormann pilot farm. But this farm was absolutely not productive. It did not work at all, simply because they did not have the local peasants' knowledge of the land.
Also hier sehen wir einen Plan von dem Gewächshaus.
This is a plan of the greenhouse, which was built near the Berghof. It was 119 meters long and 26 meters wide, and was shaped like a crescent. They tried to grow vegetables and flowers for the Berghof, but it was not enough. The Nazis were never able to grow enough food for everyone.
But with his passion for grandeur coupled with his adulation of the Führer, Martin Bormann wanted to do more. He wanted to offer Adolf Hitler a physical metaphor of his domination. In 1937, he decided to build a house on the peak of the Kelstein mountain at 1,824 meters. Built by 3,000 men in less than 13 months, it would later be christened the Eagle's Nest. From the Obersalzberg, the climb begins with a 6.5-kilometer mountain road topped with 5 tunnels leading to a plateau. From there, a long tunnel carved into the rock leads to an elevator shaft. There were 2 elevator cars. The top one was for the Nazi elite, and the one underneath was for equipment. They climbed the last 120 meters in approximately 40 seconds, arriving in the center of the house. Today, the elevator and its bronze car have been preserved, and the Eagle's Nest, untouched by the bombing of 1945, has been transformed into a high-altitude restaurant. This mythical place became the symbol of Hitler's domination during the Second World War. However, the place played virtually no role during the war.
In fact, Hitler was agoraphobic. He really didn't like the heights. He went up there just literally a handful of times.
Ultimately, this house would be used mostly by Hitler's most private companion, his mistress, Eva Braun. In one of his amateur videos, we recognize the marriage celebration between her sister, Gretel Braun, and Herbert Fegelein, an SS general. On this 1944 summer day, he was already responsible for tens of thousands of deaths. When Hitler came to spend a few days in his Berghof, time seemed to stop. The Führer wanted to take advantage of his mountain while reflecting on his political and military strategies. Albert Feiber works at the Contemporary History Institute in Munich. As part of his research, he has studied how life at the Obersalzberg was organized and has researched Hitler's habits while he stayed at his home.
His days were actually quite boring. As we know, Hitler lived at night. He got up very late, often skipping breakfast and lunch. Generally, he held his first meetings at the end of the morning. After a late lunch, Hitler and all his Berghof entourage walked to the tea house on Mount Mooslannerkopf, on the road we're on now. During these ritual walks, he sought a privileged confidant. The path was very narrow. There was only room for 2 people side by side, and they discussed highly political subjects.
From the Berghof, they walked an hour down the valley to reach the tea room. Bombed in 1945 and finally destroyed in 2006 by the local authorities, the tea room has almost disappeared and its ruins have been overrun by the forest.
Also wir sind hier auf den letzten Resten.
Here, we are on the last remains of the Mooslannerkopf tea room.
Letzte Ruinen wir hier noch sehen. Wenn man hier
Once people got here, they drank tea, coffee, ate cakes, talked innocently.
Privat, gemütlich, belanglos.
We don't know if it is true, but it is said that Hitler fell asleep once or twice during his own monologues. After an hour and a half, everyone drove back to the Berghof.
Wieder zurück zum Berghof. .
After dinner, guests gathered in the Great Hall to listen to Hitler's long monologues. Sometimes they would watch a movie, and the evening went on until 4 o'clock in the morning.
Hitler war ein großer Fan, Beispiel von amerikanischen Spielfilmen.
Hitler was a big fan of American movies, which were officially censored in Germany. But they were his favorite films, and he was a big Mickey Mouse fan too.
Life at the Berghof is the antithesis of life in Berlin. Here, the fierce dictator, ready to exterminate millions of people, gives way to a simple man, his love of nature and alpine folklore. The decoration is typically Bavarian, and even the smallest object must show the Chancellor's glory. French soldiers brought back to Paris many pieces as trophies when they came to liberate the mountain in May 1945.
This is a tablecloth with Adolf Hitler's initials, which was made in Munich and bears a floral motif, quite suitable for life in the mountains in Berchtesgaden. There are several other examples of matching tablecloths and napkins. There are several napkins of questionable color, and always with Adolf Hitler's initials. And here, the swastika. Here we have a knife, which comes from Hitler's personal silverware set, which is a bit more elaborate, with a sort of Greek motif on the handle. And then the German eagle and Adolf Hitler's initials. It really becomes a personality cult to Adolf Hitler, since really all the elements found at the Berghof, including the Kelstein house, are almost always systematically marked AH, the initials of Adolf Hitler.
Hitler used this object. It was on his personal desk. Photos show it at the Berghof, where we can see it on his desk. In it, there is his letterhead, envelopes and calling cards with his name, Adolf Hitler, and the Nazi emblem. There is still a card from his secretary reminding him about Bormann's mother's birthday.
The French soldiers' trophies from the Berghof show a sumptuous lifestyle in high contrast to that of the Berchtesgaden residents.
The residents of the city of Berchtesgaden call the residents of the Obersalzberg, Adolf and his cronies, those out there. They are waiters in white gloves. Everything is very methodical, orchestrated with a high level of protocol for the visits of the heads of state.
Since the Berghof was a place of power, we found objects given by dignitaries to show their friendship, as is the case for this box. It was a gift given to Hitler for his 50th birthday on April 20th, 1939. It is a gold and silver box. It shows the functions of the Chancellor as the nation's savior.
With time, the Obersalzberg became the Reich's second capital. Between the trinkets and the men standing at attention, politics continued to operate.
It's quite surprising, but the mountain had become a real second seat of power that functioned completely outside of normal bureaucracy. When Heinrich Himmler was there, in this quiet green environment, they did not talk about the weather, but about the deportation of the Hungarian Jews, or how many people were going to be murdered in the gas chambers. And all of this was decided orally, so mixed with their daily, ordinary conversations, weighty decisions were made.
A symbol of the Chancellor's omnipotence, the Obersalzberg and the Berghof became key places in the diplomatic relations between Germany and the rest of the world. The press often reported on world leaders and ambassadors who made official visits to Hitler in his vast Bavarian residence.
Hitler would orchestrate these arrivals. Sometimes he would come all the way down to the steps. I think when the Prince of Wales was there, he actually met him on this, at the base of the stairs and accompanied him up. When Chamberlain came, Hitler walked halfway down the stairs. On other occasions, he said, had stood at the top of the stairs and just waited for the person to come up to it. He designed his own protocol, his own theatrics around this.
From the writing of Mein Kampf to the final decisions of the war, it was in this breathtaking setting that Hitler hatched the key strategies of the Third Reich.
The planning in the summer of 1939, all of that planning took place there. Across from the Berghof, you have the Untersberg, and in the Untersberg is said to reside the soul of Friedrich Barbarossa, who one day would rise to conquest and power, and Hitler named the invasion of Russia Operation Barbarossa. This really was the place of quote-unquote inspiration for him. He famously said, "This is where I spent my most pleasant times and conceived my great ideas."
When it comes to ideas, the list is long. It was at the Berghof that he ordered the boycott of all Jewish businesses in 1933, where he prepared the Munich Agreement in 1938 and ordered the handicapped euthanasia program in 1941. And finally, it is where Hitler ordered the deportation of 500,000 Hungarian Jews in 1944. Behind these gruesome scenes was Eva Braun, Adolf Hitler's mistress. She started living there secretly in 1936 because Hitler wanted to show the world that he had no private life. But when he had no guests, or when he was absent, Eva Braun took over the premises and filmed her leisurely daily life.
For Eva Braun, the Berghof is a kind of refuge. She is recognized there. She's the boss. And Hitler always says to her, "Go to the mountain. Take your friends, your sisters."
Robert Brandner is an antiques dealer in Berchtesgaden. He specializes in a niche market, the Berghof's relics. Numerous objects have passed through his hands, and among them, letters written by Eva Braun to her best friend, Hertha Schneider.
Hertha received her letters or cards, and I had a bundle of them, saying, "How are you, my little Hertha? Do you want to spend a few days in the mountains? I'm a little lonely up here. I would enjoy your company. My sisters are coming next week," etc.
Upon her death, Eva Braun left many belongings to Hertha Schneider, and Robert Brandner was later in charge of selling them.
I had suitcases, clothes, nightgowns, tights, gloves, really everything. Some furniture, too. This dressing table comes from Eva Braun's room and stayed at the Berghof until the end. At the end of the war, a resident of Berchtesgaden took it from the Berghof. One could also say that she looted it. It turns out it was probably fair game, since Martin Bormann himself had stolen it in the first place.
During the war, Eva Braun continued to spend time with her close entourage. In 1944, the marriage between her sister and SS Fegelein was the occasion for a final festive moment. for at that time, Germany was undergoing the Allied forces' incessant attacks. And in 1943, when bombs fell on Munich, which was just a 20-minute flight away, the Obersalzberg trembled. Hitler and his faithful secretary, Martin Bormann, knew that their mountain was vulnerable. Despite all the precautions taken to build an ultra-secure area, an airstrike could easily destroy their Bavarian retreat. To protect them, Martin Bormann launched an enormous new project, the construction of a network of bunkers and tunnels buried deep inside the mountain.
This was one of the emergency exits to Hitler's own personal tunnel. This is the only access to Hitler's tunnel system today because all the other entrances have either been buried or blocked off. Back there in Hitler's own tunnel system, there were some 17 rooms if you count the toilets. There were rooms for Hitler, for his mistress Eva Braun, for his personal physician Dr. Morell, for his personal servants and his closest adjutants, and also some staff rooms for the SS guards.
The Berghoff's bunker was first built in 1943. Its construction took place in 3 distinct phases. Section A was completed around Christmas 1943. It went from a staircase located just behind the Berghof and extended to the basement of the former Hotel Zum Türken, where Hitler's personal bodyguard stayed. It included the personal apartments of the Führer and his entourage. Section B, built in 1944, extended westward. It contained all of the operational facilities: a telecommunications room, archives, a kitchen, a control room for the electricity and air conditioning. Section C, whose construction could not be completed, included a tunnel that went even deeper into the mountain to escape potential attackers. The Führer's bunker was equipped with several emergency exits, but was also connected to the bunker of Martin Bormann by a tunnel. Between the two, a shelter designed to accommodate 400 men was built under the SS barracks. Göring and Speer's houses had their own burrows. In total, in less than 2 years, a sprawling 6-kilometer and 22,000 square meter network was dug inside the Obersalzberg. This rare footage dates back to 2004. It comes from one of the rare times the Bavarian government authorized a complete exploration of the Obersalzberg's bunkers. It was led by a German archaeologist, accompanied by a camera operator.
Here's another pass.
Here we are under Martin Bormann's house. Although Allied forces went through these tunnels just after the war, there are still traces of the German occupation during the war years.
Here, they called it the casino, which served as a living room and dining room. That's some ointment. We're heading for the emergency exit. We are again above the air ducts. Here we can see the old armored door, which is on the ground.
To avoid neo-Nazi pilgrimages, the Obersalzberg's bunkers are now closed off. But one area, a few hundred meters long, is still accessible.
In this second seat of power, the bunkers were to be used not only as anti-aircraft shelters, but also as the government's underground headquarters. That's why they were intended to be so immense right from the start.
Axel Dreckol is the site's custodian. The Contemporary History Institute of Munich has entrusted him with maintaining the Obersalzberg's memory.
Here we are in a room originally reserved for the operations, hence the appearance of a large hall. Otherwise, many rooms were supposed to accommodate the families of senior party officials for long stays. They were therefore habitable. Of course, it was sparse, not luxurious, but the small rooms could serve as bedrooms, offices, control rooms. The idea was to be able to continue the war from here.
Inside, everything was designed so that the occupants could remain underground for as long as possible, while remaining isolated from the surface.
In the 1940s, Goebbels called for total war. And the logical consequence was that as the ideological delirium no longer worked above ground, they buried themselves underground. That's what the bunker shows.
The sprawling network has two levels. One filled with habitable shelters. The second, located just below, held the electricity, heat, water, and especially the very sophisticated ventilation system. At a rate of 3,000 cubic meters per hour, the air was drawn in, filtered, dehumidified, and then vented into the bunker's corridors. A slight extra pressure then allowed the stale air to be pushed outside. This system made it possible both to renew the air and, most importantly, to prevent any contaminated air from infiltrating the network. In the event of a chemical attack or bombing, leak-proof valves were used to block chemicals and fumes from entering the tunnels. The underground complex could thus operate in a closed circuit for several hours. This gigantic construction mobilized the Reich's best engineers, making it almost indestructible. The tunnels were constructed from several materials. First, solid concrete that touched the rock. Then a first brick wall to drain water leaks. Then a layer of plastic insulation, and finally a second wall made of a double row of bricks covered with plaster. In 1945, as the war was ending, the network was still under construction. The Nazi leader's goal was to create another, even deeper level.
Behind there is still an elevator shaft. The shaft is finished, but there was never an elevator. Imagine lifts that could carry trucks. In fact, it should have been a real underground city. Here we have a bunker entrance or exit. It could be reached by this staircase, and at the bottom of the stairs, access was monitored by soldiers armed with machine guns.
On the surface, the Luftwaffe added a few lines of classic defense, a battalion of anti-aircraft artillery, a fog machine, in addition to camouflaging the main buildings. In the spring of 1945, when the German army suffered heavy losses on all fronts and the country was being massively bombed by Allied aviation, the Royal Air Force decided to strike the Alpine retreat of Adolf Hitler as a symbolic gesture. On April the 28th, 1945, a shower of bombs fell on the Obersalzberg.
It was practically the only thing in Germany that hadn't been bombed, but it was, I think, a strategic decision to say we're moving the war into this particular location.
At the time, there was an early warning system. When the 15 warning sounded, you had 15 minutes to get to safety, so you had to go home. With the 10 and 5 warnings, you had to go to the nearest bunker. On the day of the Obersalzberg bombing, I did not want to go down in a bunker because I wanted to go home. But I was half an hour's walk from my house. On the road, a plane shot me. Imagine, I was on the road and a plane shot me, a little kid.
On the surface, all buildings were affected, but the bunker had worked. The bombing caused only 6 deaths. In the region, the residents of Berchtesgaden were traumatized and would soon discover the atrocities committed by the Nazis.
I was convinced that the Führer was the biggest and the strongest. I did not understand why my parents did not agree. At the end of the war, I was 13 years old. You must understand that for me, a kid, losing the war was a catastrophe, a humiliation. We were the ideal country. The Nazis were the best, pure, and without flaws. I did not know anything at the time.
As the locals finally ventured into the mountains, French troops from General Leclerc's 2nd Armored Division moved towards the quintessential symbol of Nazi power. At the same time, US forces were also arriving. Even today, 2 versions of history don't agree on who arrived at the Berghof first.
Berlin had fallen a few days before. Apparently, the ground troops didn't know that Hitler had committed suicide. They think maybe he's up there, so it's a race to victory.
The Americans arrive in the city of Berchtesgaden on May 4th. They believe they have reached their goal, Hitler's house. They are close, but actually so far away. However, not knowing the area, they stop in the city center.
The 2nd Armored Division arrives on their heels 2 or 3 hours after, according to the railway's records.
The French knew more about the area because an officer who had been taken prisoner and had traveled through there in 1940 took them to the Berghof. So the French were the first to arrive on the Obersalzberg.
A few hours earlier, the last SS soldiers on the site had set fire to the buildings. So the French soldiers happen upon a smoking Berghof. Alain Raphael is one of the first soldiers to have entered Adolf Hitler's lair. At that time, he was 24.
We traveled up to it on an extremely damaged road. We parked our tanks under the terrace. I can still see myself entering this room that overlooked the Alps. I had seen photos and movies of Hitler parading around. And I found myself in this room. I enjoyed it. Under the stairs, we broke down a door and discovered a small room. And in there were items that were as kitschy as you could imagine. Everyone helped themselves to as much as they could. But as I lost my tank afterwards, I wasn't able to keep anything.
French soldiers found the huge tunnel network built under the Berghof. To mark their passage, 3 of them engraved their initials, as well as the Cross of Lorraine, the symbol of the Free French Forces. Very quickly, the GIs caught up with the French on the mountain, also finding the smoking remains of the Berghof. After having lived under the Nazi stranglehold, the village was about to live with the American army for 45 years. The last remains of the Berghof were completely destroyed in 1952. And until 1995, US soldiers went to the Obersalzberg to relax in their free time. Once Germany reunited, Bavaria tried to make the mountain attractive to tourists again. The area has been reforested, and the last remains of the structures built by the Nazis were destroyed to make room for new buildings like this immense luxury hotel. Today, the Obersalzberg has become peaceful again. But what little remains from the wartime offers precious evidence of the period. In their own way, the remains recount the 20 years of Nazi occupation, which saw Adolf Hitler and his followers take over a small Bavarian mountain to satisfy their thirst for power.